Ms. Fiona Cross adamantly withheld my younger brother Timothy's breathing aid during a critical asthma flare-up. Her conviction was that he was merely feigning his symptoms. When I directly challenged her, her response was chilling. I am shielding your family from a contentious custody battle. I had to physically move past her to retrieve it and save him. That harrowing incident occurred 4 months prior. Yesterday, she was incarcerated. Our parents departed for their anniversary celebration around 6 in the evening. The childcare provider, Ms. Fiona Cross, from the highly rated Caring Hands Collective, initially presented as perfectly competent. She even brought a tin of her freshly baked oatmeal raisin cookies. Before leaving, our mother, Veronica Vance, and father, Victor Vance, specifically reminded Ms. Cross about Timothy's daily maintenance inhaler due at 8 o'clock. Please don't give it to him prematurely, they cautioned. He'll use it as an excuse to avoid his evening studies. They were referring to his green-capped flow vent, his routine prophylactic treatment, not his urgent rescue puffer. Predictably, Timothy, a spirited 12-year-old with a shock of sandy brown hair, and I, Serafina Vance, 16, with my dark braided hair perpetually swept over my shoulder, were engaged in a lively game of tag in the sun-drenched backyard when it began. That familiar, constricted wheeze. I recognized the sound instantly. As his elder sister, it was etched into my memory. Ms. Cross, Timothy urgently requires his blue-capped rescue inhaler. She regarded me with an unsettling skepticism, as if I were attempting some elaborate trick. Your parents explicitly stated no inhaler until 8. That's his everyday inhaler. This is a medical emergency. She then produced her smartphone, displaying our mother's text message. Timothy's inhaler at 8 p.m. Do not yield if he asks for it early. You see? She declared, her tone unwavering. I am simply adhering to instructions. Timothy's condition worsened rapidly. He was now slumped on the living room sofa, his usually rosy cheeks pale, tugging frantically at the collar of his striped polo shirt as though it were constricting his throat. I fired off a desperate text to Mother. No reply. I tried Father's number, voicemail. My phone battery blinked precariously at 7%. Ms. Cross began tapping away on her device. How to differentiate simulated asthma from genuine respiratory distress, she muttered, reading aloud from the screen. Children often hyperventilate due to anxiety. She retrieved a brown paper bag from the kitchen, attempting to place it over Timothy's mouth. Stop! That's for panic attacks, not asthma, I yelled, my voice cracking. Timothy's entire small body now strained with each breath. His abdominal muscles clenched, his shoulders heaved convulsively. He emitted a high-pitched, broken whistling sound like a rusted kettle. She then called her supervisor at Caring Hands Collective. She placed the call on speakerphone, and Lena Sterling's crisp voice resonated through our kitchen. Never deviate from parental directives. You bear full liability if anything adverse occurs. Ms. Cross nodded vigorously. There, you see. I am acting correctly. Timothy made a valiant attempt to shuffle towards us. His legs buckled beneath him. He pitched forward, dropped to his knees, crawled a mere few feet, and then collapsed. Ms. Cross hurried over. He must remain upright. My nephew also has asthma. She forcibly maneuvered him into a hard kitchen chair. She would not permit him to lean forward, despite it being the only posture that ever offered him any relief. My phone finally died. She then flung open all the kitchen windows, letting in the late autumn chill. Fresh air always helps, she pronounced, but it was frigid. Cold air exacerbates asthma. Doesn't everyone understand that? The next thing I knew, she had located Mother's collection of essential oils, eucalyptus. This assists with breathing. She began vigorously rubbing the pungent oil onto Timothy's chest. He immediately broke out in raised red welts. His skin became visibly inflamed and bumpy. Ah, she exclaimed, a triumphant glint in her eyes, as if she had uncovered a profound mystery. It's an allergic reaction, not asthma. We require antihistamines. I'm contacting emergency services. And then, her expression shifted abruptly. Your mother mentioned the custody situation with Timothy's biological father. A single call regarding medical neglect, and he gains full custody. Is that truly what you desire? She dispatched a quick text to someone, her nurse friend, and showed me the reply. Always adhere to parent instructions to circumvent liability. A fellow medical professional concurs with my judgment. Timothy vomited, mostly just bile and spittle. Nothing substantial emerged because he couldn't generate enough force to properly expel anything. Food poisoning, I knew it. She actually looked visibly relieved, her features relaxing. She began rummaging through the cupboards for antacids. She dialed poison control. While she meticulously explained to them about potential tainted poultry from dinner, Timothy slipped from the chair. She attempted to coax him into sipping water. Hydration resolves everything. He choked, and water streamed from his nose. She continuously glanced at her wrist. Just 32 more minutes. I am safeguarding your family from a custody dispute, she reiterated. Timothy managed to whisper something. I leaned in closely. His lips were a ghastly shade of blue. Not merely pale, but genuinely cyanotic. Blue, please. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. It was at that precise moment that I completely lost my composure. I don't care what you believe. He is dying. I lunged towards the medicine cabinet. She had locked it earlier. The small silver key was in her pocket. She surged forward, effectively blocking my path. I am not losing yet another assignment because children have attempted to manipulate me. I tried to push past her. She seized my wrist with bruising force. You're hurting me. Stop being so theatrical, just like your brother. I delivered a powerful kick to her shin. She doubled over, and I snatched the key from her pocket. My hands trembled so violently I could barely insert the key into the lock. She lunged for the inhaler. That's assault. I am reporting you to your parents. I dodged her outstretched hand, sprinting to Timothy's side. His lips were no longer merely blue. They were a horrifying purple. Purple fading to an ashen gray. Just then, I heard a pounding on the front door. Thank heavens. I shoved past her and yanked the door open. Our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, needed only a few seconds to assess the scene before frantically dialing emergency services. Ms. Cross continued to babble. They specified 8 o'clock. I possess it in writing. This is not my fault. I was protecting the household. The custody conflict. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like an eternity. They immediately administered oxygen to Timothy. One of them, a woman with practical, no-nonsense eyes, turned to Ms. Cross. How long has he been in this state? The parent said medication at 8 p.m. I was complying. Ms. Cross insisted, her voice shrill. Ma'am, the paramedic interrupted, her voice firm. This child was in severe respiratory distress. Ms. Cross pulled out her phone, shaking it at them. I have the text. They said 8 p.m. The other paramedic leaned in to read the screen. This refers to a preventative inhaler. You denied him his rescue inhaler. Through the living room window, I observed them. Police cruisers. 2 of them. Ms. Cross's face drained of all color. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room hummed with a maddening, incessant buzz that burrowed into my skull. I kept fixating on the dried blood beneath my fingernails, a grim memento from where Miss Cross had gripped me. The automatic doors hissed open, and Mother, Veronica Vance, burst through, her elegant anniversary gown disheveled, mascara streaking down her tear-stained face. She seized me with such force it hurt. Where is Timothy? She shook me gently, then more urgently. Mr. Henderson must have alerted them, because she kept demanding an explanation, and the words tumbled out too slowly. Father, Victor Vance, erupted through the emergency doors 8 minutes later, his tie askew, immediately accosting every nurse he encountered. Dr. Priya Sharma finally emerged from behind a set of imposing metal doors, her face etched with that grave expression medical professionals adopt when the news is dire. She informed us that Timothy had suffered severe respiratory failure and was now on a ventilator. Mother's legs gave way, and father had to catch her. We could glimpse him through a small observation window, surrounded by tubes and beeping machines, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. But it wasn't his own breathing. It was the machine sustaining him. Officer Mark Jensen, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, led me aside to a secluded corner while my parents remained pressed against the window, gazing at Timothy. He instructed me to recount the entire ordeal from the beginning, meticulously jotting notes in a small spiral-bound pad. I presented Mother's text message on her phone and elucidated the crucial distinction between the 2 types of inhalers, explaining how Miss Cross had stubbornly refused to listen. Officer Jensen's jaw tightened incrementally with each detail I provided. Around 2 a.m, Father discovered me in the hospital chapel, trembling silently. He repeatedly reassured me that it wasn't my fault, that I had saved Timothy. But all I could envision were those horrifying purple lips and that desperate whistling sound. We went for coffee at 6, and there, in the lobby, was Miss Cross, still clad in yesterday's clothes, conversing on her phone about unclear instructions. She actually approached us, reiterating her blamelessness, but Father stepped directly in front of her, his voice a low growl, ordering her to stay away from us. Dr. Sharma summoned us into a small private room 2 hours later, holding Timothy's chart. She began explaining hypoxia and potential brain complications, stating they wouldn't know the full extent until he awakened. She added that the police would require her comprehensive medical report, as this incident was entirely preventable. Then, representatives from Child Protective Services arrived, not for Ms. Cross, but for us, inquiring why we had provided ambiguous instructions and if we habitually left our children under inadequate supervision. Mother completely erupted when they questioned the repute of a licensed agency with 5-star reviews. I sat with Timothy for hours that evening, simply holding his small hand while the ventilator breathed for him. His Little League baseball trophy rested on the bedside table, and I continuously spoke to him about his team's recent victory, even though he couldn't possibly hear me. His hand twitched once, a minute tremor, but it was the first voluntary movement in 20 hours. The following morning, his eyes opened, but he gazed right through us, as if we were invisible. The neurologist conducted a battery of tests involving lights and reflex responses while we waited anxiously outside. Timothy kept asking for a dog, though we had never owned one. Our lawyer, a stern woman with a sharp gaze, met us in the cafeteria and meticulously reviewed the Caring Hands collective contract, page by page, highlighting various liability waivers. Mother produced her phone, displaying the original text about the preventative inhaler, and the lawyer stated, criminal negligence supersedes their waivers, but we need to meticulously document everything. The lawyer provided us with a checklist of items to preserve, and I spent the remainder of that day photographing every text message and email, while Mother sat with Timothy, who persisted in asking peculiar questions about imaginary pets. 2 days later, Detective Melinda O'Connell, a woman younger than I'd expected with tired but sharp eyes, called and requested my formal statement at the precinct. Mother drove me there and waited in the lobby while I sat in a small stark room with a recorder prominently placed on the table. Detective O'Connell asked me to recount everything from the very beginning, a process that consumed almost an hour, as she frequently interrupted to inquire about the precise words Ms. Cross had used. When she asked if Miss Cross appeared intoxicated or disoriented, I replied no. She had been utterly convinced of her own rectitude, and that, I told the detective, was the most terrifying aspect. Her genuine belief that she was helping. By the time we returned to the hospital, Timothy was awake and recognized us, but he exhibited significant memory gaps. He remembered playing tag, but nothing after that until awakening amidst tubes. Father hadn't left the room in 2 days, continuously holding Timothy's hand even when he slept, as if he feared letting go. The following morning, a woman arrived with an enormous floral arrangement and introduced herself as Sybil Wexler, director of the Caring Hands Collective. She presented Mother with a folder, her smile unnervingly artificial. Mother read the papers aloud. They essentially requested us to relinquish our right to sue in exchange for them covering Timothy's medical expenses. But when she reached the clause about no admission of wrongdoing, Mother ripped the entire document in half. Sybil Wexler's face flushed crimson, and she began to stammer something about being reasonable, but Mother simply pointed towards the door until she departed. An hour later, Dr. Sharma entered with her official medical report. I will never forget her words, because Mother made her repeat them 3 times. This is a case of a childcare provider interpreting instructions with a profoundly dangerous rigidity. She would likely refuse water to someone engulfed in flames if the directive specified no beverages until dinner. Severe hypoxic brain injury was narrowly averted. Oxygen deprivation for 25 to 30 minutes. Survival was due to age and previously robust health. Permanent damage is unlikely, but a possibility. The insurance company contacted us that afternoon while we were eating cafeteria sandwiches. Father put them on speakerphone so we could all hear the representative's voice, explaining they were investigating whether we had failed to provide adequate care instructions. Father's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. Our son nearly died because a babysitter refused to administer life-saving medication, and you are questioning coverage while that woman incessantly recited policy terms? That evening, a nurse entered to administer Timothy's breathing treatment, and he completely broke down, screaming and crying that she wouldn't let him have it, just like Miss Cross. I had to hold him while he sobbed and trembled. The child psychologist who visited later filled pages of notes about his trauma response. The next morning, Detective O'Connell called to inform us that Miss Cross had retained a defense attorney who was asserting she had adhered to industry standard protocols for medication administration. The detective requested our original agency contract, plus all our correspondence with them. He added that Miss Cross was publicly claiming we were negligent parents who had provided unclear instructions, a statement that prompted Mother to hurl her coffee mug against the wall. I went online that afternoon to check the Caring Hands Collective's social media page and discovered hundreds of one-star reviews from incensed parents, but also staunch defenders arguing parents must provide unambiguous instructions and babysitters are not mind readers. Then I saw a comment that made my stomach lurch. From a woman claiming Miss Cross allowed her diabetic daughter's blood sugar to plummet last year with the same excuse about following instructions. I immediately screenshotted everything and began messaging people. Within hours, 3 other families had contacted Mother with alarmingly similar accounts concerning Miss Cross and medical emergencies. One child's auto-injector withheld during an anaphylactic reaction. Another seizure medication delayed. All exhibiting the same pattern of her asserting adherence to parental instructions. We brought Timothy home that night, but he required breathing treatments twice a day and was not yet well enough to return to school. His bedroom now resembled a miniature hospital ward, equipped with a nebulizer and an oxygen monitor. I assisted him with his breathing exercises, and he asked me why Ms. Cross hadn't helped him. I couldn't articulate an answer that made any sense, because there simply wasn't one. The subsequent weeks blurred into a continuous cycle of hospital follow-ups, and Timothy constantly checking his peak flow meter every few hours, as if fearing it might abruptly drop to 0 again. Mother spent endless hours on the phone with lawyers, while Father installed new, reinforced locks on every door and window in the house. I observed him testing them at night, ensuring no one could enter without our knowledge. Timothy began carrying his blue rescue inhaler everywhere, even to the bathroom, clutching it in his sleep until his knuckles turned white. The medical negligence lawyer Mother engaged had an office adorned with newspaper clippings detailing children harmed by caregivers. He spread Timothy's hospital records across his conference table, pointing to his oxygen levels from that terrifying night, numbers so dangerously low the emergency room physician had written critical 3 times and underlined it. On February 19th, he filed a civil lawsuit against Ms. Cross and the Caring Hands Collective for gross negligence, seeking damages to cover Timothy's extensive medical bills and ongoing therapy. Within 4 hours, the agency's insurance company's lawyers filed a countersuit, alleging we had committed defamation by posting about the incident on social media, even though every word Mother wrote was demonstrably true. Mother let out a laugh, but it was not one of genuine amusement, rather a harsh, bitter sound. That afternoon, the local news station called, requesting an interview after someone had leaked the lawsuit filing to them. The reporter arrived with a camera crew, and our front yard suddenly transformed into a movie set with all the equipment and glaring lights. Father recounted the fundamental facts while Timothy watched from his bedroom window, too frightened to descend when strangers were present. The segment aired that night, bearing the headline, Babysitter Denies Rescue Inhaler to Asthmatic Child. Our phone began ringing incessantly. More reporters arrived the following morning, some camping outside our house, awaiting a quote. Father purchased security cameras and spent the entire day installing them, threading wires through walls and setting up monitors in his home office. Timothy would not leave his room when the doorbell chimed, simply sitting on his bed, clutching his inhaler, and observing his breathing treatment machine as if it might vanish. The social media post I had composed quickly garnered thousands of shares, and other parents began reaching out with their own harrowing stories about Ms. Cross and the Caring Hands Collective. Jasmine Weston messaged first, relating how Ms. Cross had refused to give her daughter insulin because she believed the girl was feigning low blood sugar for attention, resulting in the child lapsing into a diabetic coma for 3 days. Milo Richards' story was even more disturbing. His son suffered from seizures, and Ms. Cross had restrained him instead of dialing emergency services, convinced he was merely throwing a tantrum. The boy now suffered permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation. All of them, 7 families in total, converged at our house on February 20th, carrying folders overflowing with medical records and printed emails from the agency. We gathered around our dining room table, comparing timelines, and the chilling realization dawned. Ms. Cross had been operating this way for at least 4 years, consistently shielded by the Caring Hands Collective's liability waivers that parents were compelled to sign. Jasmine's daughter still wore a continuous glucose monitor that chirped every few minutes, and Milo's son sat in a specialized chair, unable to maintain an upright posture independently. The pattern was glaringly apparent in every single case. Ms. Cross unilaterally decided children were faking or exaggerating, refused to administer prescribed medications, or summon help, and the agency invariably defended her with their following parent instructions alibi. That afternoon, Timothy stood at his window, observing children walking home from school, just as he used to do before everything transpired. His friend, Aaron, waved up at him, but Timothy merely stared, offering no wave or smile. Later, he asked me what would happen if he needed help again, and no one believed him. The child psychologist's mother had found, remarked that this type of fear might forever reside within him. Yet another intangible stolen by Ms. Cross that we could never reclaim. Detective O'Connell reappeared on February 21st with news that caused mother to grasp father's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. The district attorney's office had elected to file criminal charges against Ms. Cross for reckless endangerment of a child, a felony that could result in actual incarceration. But when father inquired about the agency and Sybil Wexler, the detective shook her head, explaining that corporate liability was significantly more challenging to prove without demonstrable evidence of systemic negligence. It was then that Jasmine leaned forward and opened her folder, fanning out emails from Sybil telling parents their children were manipulative and staunchly defending Ms. Cross, even after children had been hospitalized. The detective's eyes widened as she perused them, particularly one in which Sybil wrote that children often exaggerate symptoms to evade responsibilities. This email dated just 2 days after Milo's son suffered his first seizure under Ms. Cross's supervision. Someone leaked Ms. Cross's deposition video on February 22nd, and it proliferated across social media within hours. She sat there in a tailored gray suit, mechanically repeating the same phrases as if meticulously rehearsed, asserting she had adhered to protocol, that parents were obligated to provide clear instructions, and that liability rested with ambiguous communication. When the lawyer inquired about Timothy's lips turning blue, she actually stated, "Children can be very convincing actors." She uttered it with a straight face, as if a child turning blue was something one could convincingly fake. The comment section erupted with parents detailing their own harrowing experiences. And then, something was discovered that altered everything. Ms. Cross's nursing license had expired in 2019, 3 years before she nearly killed Timothy. Yet, she had continuously advertised herself as a childcare professional with medical training throughout that entire period. The Caring Hands Collective had never verified this. Their background screening process only checked for criminal records, not the validity or currency of medical credentials. Father watched the video in his home office, the door closed, but we could still hear him shouting at the screen, hurling epithets at Ms. Cross I had never heard him utter before. The protest at the Caring Hands Collective headquarters on February 23rd commenced with just our 7 families, but swelled to almost 50 individuals by noon. Parents held signs adorned with photographs from their children's hospitalizations, oxygen masks, IV lines, cardiac monitors, images that prompted passing drivers to slow down and stare. Sybil Wexler emerged with 2 security guards, attempting to dismiss everyone as merely disgruntled clients seeking financial compensation. But Jasmine held aloft her daughter's insulin pump and declared, "Money will never restore what this agency stole from our children." The local news live-streamed the entire event on their website, and one could observe Sybil's face growing progressively redder as more parents arrived with their own narratives. Timothy watched from our car in the parking lot, clutching his inhaler so tightly the plastic creaked, flinching every time Ms. Cross's name was uttered. That night, he started sleeping in my room, dragging his blanket and pillow across the hall after mother and father retired. He would awaken gasping and grasping at his throat as if someone were choking him, then spend an hour undergoing breathing treatments he didn't actually require. Mother discovered him one morning at 6 a.m. on February 24th, sitting on my floor with a nebulizer mask on. Even though the medicine cup was empty, he was simply inhaling plain air from the machine because it provided him with a sense of security. She sat down beside him and held his hand while he practiced breathing. Later, she confided in father that it was as if Timothy was trying to prove to himself that he could still breathe. Practicing for the next time, someone might not believe him. Someone ought to inform Sybil Wexler that childcare professional with medical training typically implies the training is still valid, not something that expired when flip phones were still commonplace. The Board of Nursing initiated their investigation on February 25th, After being inundated with complaints regarding Miss Cross practicing without a valid license, it emerged that she had been falsely representing herself as a registered nurse for years after her license lapsed. And the Caring Hands Collective had been advertising her as a resident medical expert for childcare, despite never verifying her credentials. The investigator uncovered 17 additional families who had specifically hired her because they had children with medical conditions and believed they were securing the services of a legitimate nurse. The agency's liability shield began to fracture when their insurance company realized they might be liable for fraud charges, not merely negligence. Then, on February 26 at 2 p.m., Ms. Cross appeared at our front door with her lawyer, demanding we cease harassing her and retract our public statements about the incident. Timothy saw her through the living room window, and his entire body went rigid. He then started gasping and clutching his chest. A full-blown panic attack that mimicked an asthma attack precisely. I grabbed his rescue inhaler, but it offered no relief because his airways were not actually constricted. His brain simply perceived them to be, as the sight of her triggered a traumatic flashback. Mother frantically dialed emergency services while father stood rigidly in the doorway, preventing Ms. Cross from approaching any closer. And she simply stood there, in our driveway, observing the paramedics administer oxygen to Timothy. Her face remained utterly devoid of emotion, as if she were watching a television program instead of a child she had nearly killed, suffering a breakdown because of her actions. The paramedics kept Timothy on oxygen for 20 minutes, while Ms. Cross remained frozen in our driveway until a police officer finally instructed her to leave. Timothy slept in mother and father's bed that night, his rescue inhaler clutched in his hand like a beloved stuffed animal. 3 days later, an unknown number called mother's phone while we were eating breakfast. The woman on the other end refused to disclose her name, but stated she had formerly worked at the Caring Hands Collective until the previous year. She possessed training videos from 2020 saved on her laptop that depicted Sybil Wexler instructing new employees on company policy. Mother put the call on speakerphone, and we heard Sybil's voice, clear as day, admonishing a room full of people to never administer medication without explicit written permission from parents. The woman stated that Sybil reiterated this principle repeatedly in every training session, that adhering to parental instructions was paramount above all else. She sent the videos to our lawyer's email that afternoon. 5 distinct recordings of Sybil drilling this rigid rule into her staff. The next day, Timothy had to return to school with a newly drafted medical action plan, meticulously typed and triplicated by the school nurse. Everything seemed fine, until third period, when the substitute teacher observed him reaching for his inhaler during math class. She snatched it from his desk and declared, "Children should not self-medicate without adult supervision." She then carried it to her desk at the front of the room. Timothy began wheezing right there in his seat, but was too terrified to utter a word until his friend Aaron sprinted to fetch the nurse. The nurse arrived and administered his inhaler, but by then, Timothy was shaking and sobbing, not from the asthma, but from sheer terror. The school called me to pick him up, and when I arrived, he clung to my arm in the parking lot, refusing to let go. The principal met us at the door and tactfully suggested that perhaps Timothy might benefit from homeschooling or online classes for a while. Mother, usually composed, erupted at him right there in the hallway, demanding to know if they were genuinely attempting to expel a child for possessing a medical condition. 2 weeks passed before we received the letter confirming Ms. Cross's trial date had been set for August, meaning she would remain free for 6 additional months. Mother was scrolling through her social media feed that night when she saw a post in her parenting group extolling a wonderful new babysitter in Melbourne. The accompanying photograph depicted Ms. Cross seated on a couch with twin boys, a broad smile gracing her face, as if nothing untoward had ever occurred. Mother immediately screenshotted everything and dialed the number provided in the post, but the family was utterly unaware of any charges against her. I began carrying my phone everywhere thereafter, discreetly recording every conversation, with teachers, doctors, even the grocery store clerk who inquired why Timothy appeared so fatigued. Mother caught me recording her conversing with father about legal fees, and instead of becoming angry, she simply nodded and instructed me to continue. The Milburn family called 3 days later, utterly distraught, because Miss Cross had refused to give their twins their ADHD medication that very morning. She had informed them the boys were being overdrugged, and that parents these days just wanted zombie children who wouldn't behave like normal kids. They discovered our story online after she departed because something about her rigid adherence to the medicine schedule felt profoundly wrong. The mother was weeping on the phone, recounting how Miss Cross had told them we were mendacious parents attempting to profit from a lawsuit. They immediately terminated her employment and wished to join our legal action. Our lawyer confirmed this incident further established a consistent pattern of behavior. Our lawyer called the next morning with more disturbing news about the Caring Hands Collective and their persistent insurance troubles over the years. 3 different insurance carriers had dropped them in 5 years due to an excessive number of claims filed against the agency. They were now utilizing a high-risk insurance company that provided minimal coverage, which explained their consistent attempts to quietly settle cases. Every family who had lodged a complaint was offered the identical settlement, a small payment contingent upon signing agreements promising perpetual silence about the incident. We were the first to decline and publicly expose everything, which explained Sybil's fervent efforts to discredit us. Timothy attempted to return to Little League practice that weekend, but he couldn't manage to run from first to second base without pausing to use his inhaler. His coach visited our house later to encourage him to persevere, but Timothy merely stared at his baseball glove, refusing to speak. Later, he asked me what would happen if he needed help during a game, and the coach also failed to believe him. He resigned from the team the following day. Yet another cherished activity Miss Cross had robbed him of, even in her physical absence. 3 days later, Sybil Wexler was arrested when investigators uncovered that 5 of her babysitters possessed fake or expired certifications. Father was in the garage when Mother received the call, and he punched a hole straight through the drywall when she informed him Sybil was already out on bail. The agency continued to operate as if nothing had transpired, still dispatching babysitters to families who remained oblivious to the ongoing crisis. Timothy's school organized an assembly focusing on medical emergencies after 3 teachers confessed they, too, would not have recognized the distinction between the 2 types of inhalers. The school nurse brought both varieties to display to everyone, elucidating how one prevents attacks and the other intervenes during an active episode. Timothy sat in the back row with his hood pulled up, attempting to become invisible while everyone's gaze lingered on him. His friend Aaron bravely informed everyone at lunch that Timothy was essentially a hero for surviving the ordeal, which was kind, but offered Timothy no solace. Then, the true bombshell detonated when our lawyer received a call from individuals who had previously worked with Miss Cross at a hospital years ago. She had been compelled to resign in 2018 after repeatedly disregarding physicians' orders, convinced she possessed superior medical judgment. One nurse recounted how Miss Cross would independently alter medication dosages, omit treatments she disagreed with, and vociferously argue with doctors concerning patient care. The hospital had permitted her to quietly resign rather than terminating her, which meant she could continue working with children through agencies that failed to conduct thorough background checks. The revelation about her past infuriated me so profoundly, I couldn't sleep that night. April 2nd arrived, and I seized my phone to create a new online account titled Kids Medical Voices. I filmed myself discussing how to discern the difference between preventative and rescue inhalers. Timothy, with a nervous but determined smile, displayed his 2 inhalers to the camera, holding them side by side, the orange-capped one for daily use, and the blue-capped one for emergencies. Within 24 hours, the video had 50,000 views. Comments flooded in from children whose parents dismissed their stomach pain or whose teachers insisted they were feigning headaches. 3 days later, we received a call from the State Regulatory Board, informing us they were launching a formal investigation into childcare agency regulations. They requested our testimony at a public hearing downtown. Timothy initially agreed to speak, but when we reached the parking garage, he began trembling uncontrollably and couldn't catch his breath. Not asthma this time, but pure, overwhelming panic. I entered alone and stood at the microphone, my voice initially cracking. The room fell into absolute silence as I meticulously described that terrifying night. People actually applauded when I concluded my testimony. April 12th brought another appointment with a specialist who confirmed what we already instinctively knew about Timothy: post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from witnessing adults ignore his medical emergency. The bills continued to arrive in thick envelopes that Mother would open at the kitchen table. $200,000 and steadily climbing, with therapy sessions not covered by insurance. Guardian's insurance company sent a letter offering $50,000 to settle everything. Mother contemptuously tossed it into the recycling bin. 3 days later, Dr. Sharma called and confirmed she would serve as our expert witness, despite cautionary advice from other medical professionals not to involve herself. She meticulously authored a report stating the delay in administering Timothy's rescue inhaler amounted to attempted manslaughter. My online advocacy account reached 100,000 followers by April 18th. Children from across the country were sharing their experiences about adults who simply refused to listen. Timothy designed a logo for the account featuring a blue inhaler adorned with small wings. Dr. Sharma generously assisted me in co-authoring a guide on self-advocacy during medical emergencies. Then, everything veered wildly off course on April 22nd. Ms. Cross appeared on a widely listened to online audio program, informing the host she was a victim of woke parenting. She asserted Timothy was performing his symptoms and that I had attacked her without provocation. The host enthusiastically concurred with her every assertion, labeling us money-hungry parents attempting to enrich themselves through a lawsuit. Ms. Cross presenting with a lawyer to demand cessation of harassment is akin to a burglar suing you for installing locks on your doors. The sheer audacity of some individuals truly knows no bounds. The recorded interview rapidly propagated across online platforms. Timothy discovered it 3 days later when a classmate at school showed him. He watched the entire segment without uttering a single word. That night, he quietly asked me if perhaps she was correct, and if he had exaggerated the severity of his condition. The insidious way she had burrowed into his psyche, even months later, made me want to scream in frustration. On April 30th, we met with a prosecutor who informed us they were adding attempted manslaughter charges based on Dr. Sharma's comprehensive report. However, she cautioned us that Ms. Cross had worked with children for 30 years without a single official complaint on her record. Juries, she explained, tended to side with older women who presented a grandmotherly demeanor. We urgently needed more families to come forward with their own stories. By May 5th, 14 families had joined a class action lawsuit against the Caring Hands Collective. The company promptly declared bankruptcy to evade financial responsibility. But, astonishingly, they reopened the very next week under a new moniker, Cherished Care Solutions. Same office, same personnel, identical policies, and Sybil Wexler remained at the helm. Father hired a private investigator on May 10th after learning of the agency's swift reestablishment. The investigator, though costly, had prior experience with complex bank fraud cases. Within 3 days, he unearthed something truly staggering. Sybil had transferred $2.3 million to offshore accounts just prior to declaring bankruptcy. The investigator continued digging and discovered she was operating 5 distinct babysitting agencies across 3 states, all under different names, but all adhering to the same deplorable policies. Mother wanted to immediately submit all evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but our lawyer advised us to accumulate more irrefutable proof first. Timothy commenced martial arts training on May 15th, as his therapist believed it might alleviate his anxiety. His sensei also had asthma and understood the importance of keeping inhalers readily accessible. During the breathing exercises, Timothy actually smiled for the first time since that terrible night. He was no longer the same child, but at least he was discovering mechanisms to cope. Our story began to polarize the community. By May 20th, some parents withdrew their children from Timothy's school, alleging we were overly litigious and unjustly destroying a reputable agency. Others began sharing their own horrific experiences concerning the Caring Hands Collective. One mother cornered me at the grocery store and angrily declared I was ruining that poor woman's life over a misunderstanding. I abandoned my full shopping cart right there and walked out. Timothy's medical team decided to produce a documentary about children's medical rights on May 25th. They invited Timothy to participate, promising to obscure his face. Witnessing him reenact that night with professional actors portraying us was brutal. Mother had to leave the room when they reached the part where his lips turned blue. Father's jaw was clenched so tightly, I feared his teeth would crack. Timothy repeatedly articulated that other children needed to be aware that such an ordeal could happen to them. The FBI finally raided the Caring Hands Collective offices on May 30th after receiving our irrefutable evidence regarding the wire fraud. They arrested Sybil Wexler on federal charges directly in front of her stunned employees. Ms. Cross, upon hearing the news, immediately contacted the prosecutor, offering to testify against the agency in exchange for reduced charges. The entire empire was crumbling, yet Timothy still awoke, gasping for air every night. Victory felt hollow when your brother remained broken. Timothy received an invitation to his friend Aaron's pool party on June 10th, but he refused to approach the water. He sat rigidly on the deck, clutching his inhaler, observing the other children play. When someone playfully splashed water nearby, he panicked and fled inside. He was 12 years old, and now fearful of everything. Miss Cross had stolen his childhood, and I could not forgive that. Her lawyer filed a motion on June 15th, alleging I was harassing her through social media. The judge meticulously reviewed all my online advocacy videos in court, while Miss Cross sat there, radiating smug satisfaction. The judge declared that educating children to advocate for their medical needs was not harassment, but a public service. It was our first substantive legal win, and Miss Cross's face went utterly white. We held our first family therapy session on June 20th, where we all openly discussed that night together. Timothy revealed he believed he was dying and vividly described the darkness creeping in from the periphery of his vision. Mother sobbed so convulsively she could barely breathe. Father admitted he fantasized about personally confronting Miss Cross. I confessed the overwhelming guilt I felt for not dialing emergency services sooner, even though everyone repeatedly assured me I had done everything correctly. The state hearing on June 25th was packed with 23 families who had previously utilized the Caring Hands Collective. Each individual recounted harrowing tales of medical neglect, dismissed emergencies, and children whose desperate pleas were ignored. The commissioner appeared visibly ill as he absorbed the deluge of testimony. Sybil's lawyer repeatedly objected to what he termed inflammatory testimony, but the room actually erupted in laughter at his expense. The commissioner silenced him with a raised hand and announced the agency would be immediately shut down pending a full investigation. Sybil's face turned deathly pale when they added that federal charges were imminent. 5 days later, on June 30th, Ms. Cross's neighbor contacted us. She had been going door to door with a printed stack of papers, vehemently claiming she was being persecuted for scrupulously adhering to parental instructions. The neighbor forwarded us the crowdfunding link where Ms. Cross asserted she was a victim of cancel culture who required financial assistance for her legal defense. She had already amassed $30,000 from individuals who had only heard her meticulously crafted side of the story. Father reported it to the crowdfunding platform that same afternoon, while Mother furiously hurled a coffee mug at the kitchen wall. The 4th of July was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but the acrid smoke from the fireworks severely affected Timothy. We ended up watching the display from our car, all windows tightly rolled up, while his nebulizer hummed softly on the center console between us. He gazed out at the other children running around with sparklers and muttered that he hated her. It was the first time I'd heard him express anything akin to anger instead of fear since that night. His therapist later informed Mother that it signified he was beginning to process the trauma he had endured. 5 days thereafter, the state legislature passed emergency legislation mandating that all childcare workers complete comprehensive training on the distinction between maintenance and emergency medications. They dubbed it Timothy's Amendment, which should have felt like an unequivocal victory. But Ms. Cross's lawyer appeared on the news, denouncing it as governmental overreach based on one misunderstanding. One misunderstanding, as if my brother nearly dying was just a simple, innocent error anyone could commit. The documentary finally aired on July 15th, and my phone buzzed incessantly with messages. Some parents expressed gratitude for educating them about crucial medication distinctions they had never understood. But the hate mail also poured in. labeling us crisis actors and money grabbers attempting to achieve notoriety from a fabricated narrative. Mother deleted all her social media accounts that night, but I retained mine, convinced someone needed to document the unvarnished truth. The pretrial hearing on July 20th witnessed Ms. Cross's lawyer attempting his most ludicrous maneuver yet. He stood up and asserted she suffered from dementia and was not mentally competent to stand trial. The prosecutor calmly produced printed transcripts from 3 different online audio interviews she had conducted, plus all her meticulously detailed crowdfunding posts explaining her side of the story. The judge actually uttered the phrase selective dementia aloud and scheduled the trial for August 15th. Timothy had to practice his testimony on July 25th with the victim advocate in a small office that smelled distinctly of old carpet. He couldn't complete his description of that night without reaching for his inhaler twice. They collectively decided he would testify via video link from another room so he wouldn't have to directly face her. The advocate repeatedly insisted this was to shield him from further trauma, but he was already experiencing nightmares every single night. I accompanied Sarah, the victim advocate, on July 30th when she instructed Timothy's friends on what an asthma attack truly looked like. 12-year-old children sat in a circle, learning to count breaths per minute and when to dial emergency services. Aaron raised his hand and solemnly promised he would always believe Timothy, even if teachers did not, and they established a buddy system where someone would always accompany him at recess. These were children educating themselves in emergency medicine because the adults had already failed them once. Sybil Wexler's federal wire fraud hearing occurred on August 5th, and Mother insisted we all attend to support the other families. Sybil pleaded guilty and received house arrest with substantial fines, but no actual prison time. The prosecutor grimly predicted she would likely be operating another agency within 2 years once people's memories faded. Mother screamed so loudly in the parking garage afterwards that a security guard came running. We spent August 10th engaged in final trial preparations with 17 witnesses poised to testify, including 3 medical experts who would meticulously elucidate the functionality of rescue inhalers. Ms. Cross had character witnesses who had known her for years, but none had witnessed her during an actual medical emergency. Our lawyer continuously reiterated that juries were unpredictable, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Then, on August 12th, during jury selection, Ms. Cross walked directly up to Mother in the courthouse hallway. She leaned in close and whispered that she had been protecting us from losing custody and that we should be grateful to her. Mother's entire body began to tremble, but she did not strike, though I observed her fists clench. An officer quickly stepped between them and instructed Ms. Cross to maintain her distance from the victim's family. She smiled blandly at him and asserted she had done nothing wrong before returning to her lawyer. 3 days later, we sat in the courtroom for opening statements. The prosecutor rose and clicked through a series of slides projected onto a large screen, meticulously depicting every minute of that terrifying night. She indicated the timeline with a laser pointer. 32 minutes from the moment I first requested Timothy's inhaler to the arrival of the paramedics. 32 excruciating minutes of my brother suffocating while Ms. Cross stubbornly insisted she possessed superior judgment. The defense lawyer then rose and dismissively labeled it a tragic misunderstanding. He stated, "My clients gave unclear instructions about which inhaler to use." I could see Timothy watching from the witness room through the glass door. He was clutching his inhaler so tightly his knuckles were white. The defense calling it a tragic misunderstanding is like saying the Titanic had a minor ice cube problem. Except this ice cube had 30 years of childcare experience and a law degree. That afternoon, they called me to testify first. I walked to the witness stand, my legs feeling like rubber. The prosecutor asked me to recount every minute of that night. I described Timothy's wheeze beginning during our game of tag, Ms. Cross's refusal to give him his rescue inhaler, her obsessive online searches for fake asthma symptoms, while his lips turned blue. The defense attorney then rose for cross-examination. He asked why I hadn't called emergency services immediately if I believed it was so serious. I reminded him I was 16, and she was the adult who claimed she had previous experience with asthma. He suggested I was exaggerating everything for the financial gain of the lawsuit. I then held up the crime scene photographs, displaying my bloody fingernails from where I had frantically clawed at the locked medicine cabinet. The jury stared, transfixed, at the grim images. The following morning, the paramedics testified about finding Timothy. One of them described his lips as cyanotic, meaning blue, from a severe lack of oxygen. His oxygen saturation level was at 68%, when a normal reading is above 95%. The paramedics stated that Timothy was mere minutes from death when they arrived. He broke his professional composure and admitted that in 20 years, he had never witnessed a caregiver refuse rescue medication during active respiratory failure. He termed it unconscionable, a word I had to look up later. Ms. Cross sat there, meticulously taking notes as if attending a business meeting. That afternoon, Dr. Sharma displayed Timothy's brain scans on the courtroom screen. She explained how oxygen deprivation affects the brain and highlighted specific areas that had narrowly avoided permanent damage. She stated, her voice resonating with authority, "Another 5 minutes, and we would be discussing wrongful death, not child endangerment." Ms. Cross's lawyer continuously raised objections to everything, but the judge permitted her to continue. One juror visibly began to weep when Dr. Sharma presented the comparison between normal brain scans and what Timothy's could have resembled. On day 3, they played Timothy's video testimony, as he was too anxious to testify in person. His small voice filled the entire courtroom through the speakers. He described his desperate inability to breathe and his attempts to convey to Ms. Cross that he needed help. He recounted her telling him he was faking, and being dramatic. He said he believed he was going to die and never see us again. Halfway through the video, he suffered an anxiety attack and required his nebulizer. The judge called a recess to allow everyone to compose themselves. Ms. Cross muttered something about him being so dramatic, and 2 jurors turned to stare at her. That afternoon, Jasmine Weston and Milo Richards testified about their own devastating experiences with Ms. Cross. Jasmine's daughter had suffered a severe allergic reaction, and Ms. Cross had refused to use the autoinjector. Milo's son had experienced a diabetic emergency, and she had withheld his glucose tablets. The defense objected, arguing this was prejudicial, but the judge ruled that a pattern of behavior was relevant to intent. Ms. Cross's confident facade began to visibly crack. On day 4, Ms. Cross finally took the stand herself. She continued to insist she had meticulously followed protocol and had done nothing wrong. She disparagingly referred to all the families as hysterical and asserted they were just after money. When the prosecutor displayed the video of Timothy's testimony, she actually stated, her voice devoid of empathy, "Children can be very convincing actors." The prosecutor then asked if she still genuinely believed she had done nothing wrong. She replied, "Absolutely nothing," without any hesitation. During cross-examination, the prosecutor systematically dismantled her testimony. She produced Ms. Cross's expired nursing license from 15 years prior. She displayed paperwork documenting her dismissal from a hospital for consistently disregarding emergency protocols. She played the training videos, elucidating the critical difference between preventative and rescue inhalers. The prosecutor asked if she knew the difference between the 2 types of inhalers. Ms. Cross stated yes, but attempted to offer a convoluted explanation. The prosecutor cut her off, asking if she chose not to give Timothy his rescue inhaler. Ms. Cross responded that the parents had told her not to. The prosecutor demanded a simple yes or no answer. Ms. Cross reiterated she followed instructions. The prosecutor asked again for a definitive yes or no. After a long, agonizing pause, Ms. Cross finally uttered yes. That evening, we all gathered in Timothy's room, awaiting closing arguments the following day. Timothy couldn't sleep and repeatedly checked that his inhaler was on his nightstand. We didn't converse much, but simply sat there together. Father held Mother's hand, and I held Timothy's hand. We were fundamentally different people than we had been 6 months ago. We were harder, more vigilant, but we were still here, together. The next morning, both lawyers presented their closing arguments. The defense claimed it was a good faith error and a case of parental miscommunication. The prosecutor displayed the text message again on the large screen, showing Mother's message about Timothy's inhaler at 8 p.m. She explained how any reasonable person would understand this referred to routine medication, not emergency medication during an active asthma attack. She concluded, her voice resonating with conviction, Ms. Cross chose rigid protocol over a child's life. The jury withdrew to deliberate, and we waited in that peculiar courthouse limbo where time seemed to warp. 27 agonizing hours they took. Mother paced the hallway, wearing a visible path in the ugly green carpet, while Father sat frozen on the bench, checking his phone every 30 seconds, though it never rang. Timothy remained home with our Aunt Eleanor, as the prosecutor advised children should not endure this part. I consumed 12 bags of vending machine chips and vomited twice in the restroom. When the bailiff finally summoned us back, my legs felt like water. Miss Cross stood when the judge instructed her to, still wearing that same smug, self-satisfied expression, as if she possessed some secret knowledge we lacked. The foreman read from his small card, and I held my breath so tightly I saw spots. Guilty of reckless endangerment of a child. Guilty of practicing without a valid license. She didn't even blink. Timothy was watching on the video link from home, and I saw him squeeze Aunt Eleanor's hand so hard his knuckles whitened. Mother collapsed against Father's shoulder, and he held her while she shook with silent sobs. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out, but then the prosecutor rose and inquired about bail. She presented the judge with Miss Cross's social media post from that very morning, in which he labeled the trial a witch hunt and accused the parents of being liars trying to get money. The judge's face darkened perceptibly, and he denied bail right there. Miss Cross began screaming about persecution and demanding her supporters be heard. But the court officers were already in motion. They placed handcuffs on her, and she continued yelling all the way out the door about how she was saving children from manipulative families. Timothy's voice came through the laptop speaker, so quiet we almost missed it. She can't hurt anyone else now. Outside the courthouse, news crews waited like vultures. They thrust microphones at us, and Mother attempted to shield us, but Timothy bravely stepped forward. His voice was steady when he spoke, unlike the terrified child from February who couldn't breathe. Kids need adults who listen. When we say we can't breathe, believe us. A reporter asked if he had anything to say to Miss Cross, and he simply shook his head. The next morning, Sybil Wexler's name dominated the news. Her agencies were summarily shut down after the state revoked their licenses. 147 families came forward with complaints dating back 8 years. Stories about babysitters who ignored allergies, who allowed children to wander off, who fell asleep on the job. The state announced an emergency fund for affected families. Suddenly, our phone rang nonstop with other parents wanting to know how to file claims. 2 weeks later, we returned for sentencing. Timothy remained at school this time because he had a math test, and he said he wanted to be normal for one day. The judge sentenced Miss Cross to 3 to 5 years in state prison, plus a lifetime ban from working with children. Even as he read the sentence, She continued to insist she had done nothing wrong. Your rigid adherence to perceived protocol over human life demonstrates a dangerous lack of judgment, he told her, his voice firm. She merely stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. The civil case against the insurance companies commenced the following week, but they offered a settlement before we even reached opening arguments, $2.8 million. Our lawyer advised us to accept, stating that juries were unpredictable and Timothy needed closure more than he needed a protracted trial. The money would cover his ongoing therapy and medical bills, and perhaps his college education someday, if he desired it. Timothy surprised everyone by returning to his Little League field that September. He couldn't play anymore due to the lingering damage to his lungs, but he wanted to help coach the younger kids. He educated them about asthma and meticulously ensured every single coach knew the crucial difference between maintenance and rescue inhalers. I'm the safety expert now, he declared, his voice filled with newfound purpose. And for the first time since February, I saw him truly smile. We attempted to have a normal family dinner one evening in September. No one spoke of the trial, the settlement, or the therapy appointments. We discussed my college applications, Timothy's martial arts class, and father's fantasy football team. We were all pretending to be okay, and we all knew it. But sometimes, pretending is practice for the real thing. The final legal development occurred when Miss Cross's appeal was denied. Her dwindling supporters appeared at the courthouse with signs proclaiming, "Parents lie, sitters suffer." We drove past without stopping. Their protest no longer held any sway over us. What truly mattered was Timothy finally sleeping through the night without nightmares. What mattered was Mother no longer flinching every time the phone rang. What mattered was Father deleting the security camera application from his phone. What mattered was our family gradually learning how to simply exist again after everything had shattered. October arrived with the news that the documentary about our case had won a prestigious award at a film festival and raised $500,000 for children's medical advocacy groups. The producers arranged a video link so Timothy and I could address the ceremony from home, as travel was still too taxing for him. I kept my part concise, simply stating that every child deserved to be heard in medical emergencies. 3 to 5 years for choosing Google over giving a dying kid his inhaler. The judge basically said, "Your brain doesn't work, right?" in fancy legal words. While Ms. Cross stood there like he was speaking Klingon, Timothy added that adults should learn to listen. And we could hear people clapping through the computer speakers. His therapist had been working with him diligently twice a week since March, and by mid-October, she quietly pulled Mother aside to report that he was making substantial progress, experiencing fewer panic attacks, and achieving better sleep, even though he still carried his inhaler everywhere and checked it constantly. Small steps forward were still undeniably steps forward. The one-year follow-up appointment with Dr. Sharma revealed some minor scarring in Timothy's lungs, but his function tests returned favorable results, prompting her to remark that he was strong, not merely lucky, and that having someone fight for him had made all the difference. Timothy actually smiled when he said I was scary when I became angry. And it was the first time any of us could laugh about that night without simultaneously crying. Halloween rolled around, and Timothy surprised us all by expressing a desire to go trick-or-treating for the first time since everything had happened. He chose to dress as a doctor because they save people. He only made it to 5 houses before the anxiety became overwhelming, and we had to return home. But 5 houses was 5 more than we had anticipated he could manage. So we counted it as a significant win. The state legislature passed a sweeping childcare reform package in early November that mandated comprehensive background checks, essential medical training, and clear rules distinguishing various types of medications. Timothy watched the governor sign it into law on television. "We did that," he murmured quietly. "We changed things for other kids." His support group for children grappling with medical trauma met every Monday at the hospital, and he returned home visibly lighter each time, discussing how he wasn't the only one who felt scared or angry or confused about what had transpired. My early admission letter to the pre-med program arrived mid-November, and in my essay, I wrote about my aspiration to become the kind of doctor who genuinely listens to children and their families. Timothy enthusiastically helped me select my courses, adamantly insisting I prioritize the emergency medicine class. Mother hovered protectively over Timothy when he offered to assist with Thanksgiving meal preparations, but we all understood she couldn't help but be overprotective now. And he meticulously crafted the cranberry sauce, declaring he was okay, truly okay, and we were finally beginning to believe him. One of the twin boys' mothers called the weekend before Thanksgiving to report that their sons were thriving, exhibiting no lasting problems from when Ms. Cross had refused their medication either. And she thanked us profusely for speaking up, asserting we had undoubtedly saved other children from enduring the same ordeal. Thanksgiving Day arrived, and Timothy, for the first time ever, stood to offer grace. He thanked God for me fighting for him, for Mother and Father believing him, for Dr. Sharma saving him, and even for the prosecutor who had delivered justice. And then he took a deep breath, entirely devoid of fear, and added, "Thanks for breathing." Just breathing. And we all breathed with him, deeply, freely, and finally, whole again.